I think it's a combination of factors. I mean, we have to look back where we started to see the increase was in the late 80s, early 1990s. And a lot of it had to do with various industries that many of which advertised in Mexican newspapers for workers to come for agriculture, turkey processing, chicken processing, pork, those kinds of industries, carpet, textiles, where they needed workers, or not necessarily in some instances where they needed workers, but where they needed workers who would work for less than what the U.S. workers in those areas would do. And then over time, by kind of word of mouth, you know, we had more individuals coming. And what we found in various parts of the South, especially North Carolina, is that early on the majority of Latino immigrants were from Mexico, but not the normal sending states that we think about when we think about California and Arizona and New Mexico and Texas. These were individuals that were coming from the center part of Mexico and down in the south of Mexico. So these were very different people than those that had traditionally been here. And so over time, I think we've just seen the large increase. In fact, now the Southwest still has the largest proportion of Latinos, but now the South is second. And if the trend continues, it may in fact overtake the Southwest. It varies by where these populations exist. The assumption that somehow groups that are similarly situated should in fact have similar policy goals and objectives only gets one side of it. There is the other side, and this is the side that a lot of my research deals with, is that similar situation leads to competitive behavior as opposed to the assumption that somehow they will be natural allies. And we see that if you kind of stratify, so you can have an elite group of blacks, an elite group of Latino leaders who find it very easy to find common ground around certain things. But in neighborhoods, when people are competing over jobs and housing, you know, it becomes a very, very different dynamic. So I think it's really a simplistic, but it was the dominant paradigm in the urban politics literature in the 1970s and early 80s, that this is in fact what would happen between these populations and among the various groups of these populations. But we find a very different dynamic depending on the circumstances. Well, the literature's mixed on that. I mean, the research has shown both outcomes. Okay, so there is no definitive position that increased contact leads to reduced prejudice, or that increased contact leads to increased prejudice. We see both of those dynamics. So there's not, a one right answer. The research on intergroup contact and contact theory shows both outcomes, depending on the conditions. I don't know whether I'd say it's the worst kept secret. I think because individuals in certain communities, and Earl Hutchinson is in Los Angeles, right? That there has been a history, of kind of this mixed relationship. Tom Bradley was able to put together a coalition of blacks, Latinos, Asians, liberal whites, primarily Jewish voters, to maintain his office in City Hall for like 20 years. But then that coalition began to break down because these different groups started having different thoughts and ideas about what should happen. And you saw population changes, like For example, Compton, which we always think of because of the riots in the 60s and everything, that Watts and Compton were primarily African American cities. I mean, they used to be part of Los Angeles, and then they were kind of, pushed out. But now what we still have black political leadership dominating in those two areas, but the population base now is primarily Latino. So when you have, if you put it in the context of when, in a different generation, when population dynamics began to change, whites still had political power where they still controlled the school boards and the office of the mayor and the Congress or whatever, but the population base was black. Blacks began to make certain demands. Now when you have another changing dynamic where the political leadership and the school board and everything are now black because they have been successful and the population dynamic is now Latino, you're going to see the same dynamics that hey, we need to be part of this. And so times change, and with demographic changes, you are going to see relationships change. I know when you read some of the literature and some of the work that I've done, and you survey these populations, the concern is for a loss of economic opportunity and political power. That somehow these individuals who are new, particularly in most of the South, will somehow begin to leapfrog over indigenous black populations in terms of their concerns and issues. So I'm not sure that it's just poverty as much as it is just kind of a broader range of issues and the concern that one group, that everything is a zero sum, that if they win, we lose, and if we win, they lose. The Latino community, we use the word Latino as an umbrella term, but it encompasses lots of different groups. And so the experience of a Mexican American in Texas is not going to be the same as a Cuban American in Miami or a Cuban American in Tampa. And these are two different groups of people. Or a Puerto Rican out of New York, or a Mexican American out of Chicago. Okay? And so there may be the ability, and I say this carefully, to talk about a generalized Black American experience that with segregation and Jim Crow and a whole host of things, that even if blacks were from Philadelphia or New York or Texas or Los Angeles, there was some similarity in the historical nature of how the group was dealt with in the United States. For Latino populations, because the populations differ, the experiences are going to be different. And so in the Southwest, Mexican Americans were treated and segregated along with blacks in schools. In fact, one of the first, or not one of the first, because the first desegregation case was Chinese American out of Mississippi in 1920-something, Wong R. I'm blanking on the Guam Lo or something, who didn't want, because Mississippi law segregated the Chinese with blacks, didn't want to be segregated with blacks. And so when you're in the Southwest, many of the school districts were black and Mexican, but then, creatively, since Mexicans in some senses were declared white, were determined to be white, then they said their schools were integrated because they had blacks and Mexicans. And since Mexicans could be classified as white, now they had an integrated school. And I think it was the Westminster versus Denver Supreme Court case that actually said, no, you can't do that. So what I'm just trying to say is that the experiences of Latino populations are varied and cannot be as generalized as one can about the Black American experience, although you will have regional differences, you know, but there is a more kind of historical context for the Black American experience in the United States than for the various Latino populations. So the assumption that there is going to be a generalized Latino experience is just not empirically. If I had the solution to that, you know, we wouldn't have any problems. This is, you know, this is something the United States has struggled with since the very beginning of our nation. I mean, when I teach, my position about American politics is that one cannot understand American politics if you don't understand that the role that race has played from the very beginning of the country. So this is a very difficult situation. I mean, in the Constitution, the bargains were about slavery. You know, which states, whether or not the new Constitution was going to outlaw slave importation. They said, well, we're not going to touch this for 20 years. But then they had the Fugitive Slave Act in the original Constitution. So this is something that is a thread in the American fabric that can be pulled and tweaked so easily to create issues. And I think part of what has happened and what does happen is that it's very difficult for us as citizens of the United States to have a real open discussion about the continued role that race plays in individuals' lives and what that says about opportunities, what that says about the ability to kind of overcome centuries of inequality. And I mean, if you think, you know, I'm kind of going around and you know, I'm not really answering the question because I don't think I have an answer, a definitive answer about that. I mean, we have the first Black American president of the United States who is constrained to be able to talk about issues of race. Because when he does, then everybody jumps on him. I mean, Mayor de Blasio, whose son is Black. Just like every other parent with Black children, you talk to your kids about issues with the police. When he says he's done that with his son, oh my gosh, he's criticized. That doesn't happen. Well, of course. But he couldn't even be honest about how he's raising his son without someone coming at him that somehow he's inflaming race issues, you know. It reinforces for those who don't trust the system that this is just what we expected to happen. But it also creates a cynicism, or plants the seeds of cynicism for a younger generation that might not have thought that the system wouldn't work. You know? But the problem, not the problem, but the ability of incidents like Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, to last in the public consciousness is really not that long. I mean, I think about the Newtown children's shootings, you know, and how in the moment we were all just upset. But then no policies change, nothing, you know, nothing happens. And then you have the wackos who want to come out and say, well, they didn't really happen, right? It's a government conspiracy or something. I mean, so it will have a lasting legacy, but I think the legacy is going to be one of reinforcing distrust where it already existed and creating questioning, maybe cynicism among younger students, younger people who didn't have that distrust in the beginning. My children are mixed race. And my husband and I mean, there's no Pollyanna about us at all. We raised black daughters who understand their two sides of their family, but they have no illusions about how the world sees them, and they have the defenses and the confidence necessary to maneuver in that world very, very successfully. And I can't speak for all parents with mixed race children, but I think a lot of parents approach it the same way that we did. You have to provide your children with defenses and how the world will see them. It depends on their party identification. That if in fact most black elected officials, save a few, are Democrats. If you live in a state where the Democrats control both houses of the legislature, then you're in a pretty good position to kind of push some of your policies through. If, however, the Republicans control the state house and the legislature, then you're going to lose, as will the other Democrats. And so there's a lot more dynamics than just the kind of race of the representative that goes into whether or not these policies are going to be forthcoming. We have, this new Congress has the largest number of Latinos and blacks ever, but it's controlled by the Republicans. I mean, one of the reasons why there's a higher proportion of blacks and Latinos in prisons, they're arrested at higher rates for things that white youth are not. I mean, and particularly children. You know, 4 or 5 white guys standing on the corner, you know, police, hi, how you doing? Same number, black kids, Latino kids, somehow they're up to something. So they end up being engaged with the system on things that white children would not. And so over time, the numbers kick up. Now, it's not to say that we might not see a higher proportion of black-on-black homicide. I mean, okay, all homicides basically are intraracial. You are more likely to be killed by someone of your own race than you are by someone of another race. The one crime that tended to be basically interracial was purse snatching. You know, a white female victim, a black kid in tennis shoes. But a lot of crimes are intra-racial. And when you look at conviction rates for homicide, that the race of the victim plays a large role in terms of what happens in the criminal justice system. 2 of my former students, Veshla Weaver at Yale, is working on incarceration, and Tracy Bird, she's now at Northwestern. Both of them are looking at why the system needs to be changed and how some things are so ingrained. Tracy, she used the state of Georgia, and she was able to look at pictures of inmates. And what she discovered was that lighter-skinned blacks fared better in prison than darker-skinned blacks. And so there are all of these complexities that go into the system. Veshla was looking at, and this was years ago, but her book focuses on felon disenfranchisement. And the origins of felon disenfranchisement was in Mississippi, where the legislature was trying to figure out ways to disenfranchise blacks. So they made certain crimes available to have your rights stripped. So since that time, since homicides were committed mostly by whites against whites, that was not a crime for which you'd lose your political rights. But let's say robbery, because that was committed more by blacks, was one of those. So it was all of these kind of things like, what? I could be a murderer and still be able to vote, but I can rob a house and I'll lose my rights. So that the origins of the felon disenfranchisement are all rooted in kind of racial dynamics in the United States. So there's just so much complexity. And if I had a solution for the issue of the criminal justice system, you know. But I think one of the things, and this again goes back to, if you look, you know, kind of Mayor de Blasio, you really do have to tell children of color that they are more likely to be arrested for things that their white classmates might not. I read it was either a news story or something I read in one of the magazines of the New York Times or something of I think she was like 12 or 13-year-old, two friends, black girl and a white girl. And the white girl actually hit another girl in the bathroom or something. And the black girl only kind of wrote something about the girl on a bathroom stall. The school, the principal said that if they both paid the damages for whatever happened to this girl, that everything would be wiped clean. The white family paid, I think it was $150, $200. The black child's parents couldn't afford it. So she ended up being referred to the system, to juvenile hall. And so now and the only thing she did was to write something. But because her parents couldn't pay, it was restitution to the girl, because I think she wrote something on her tennis shoes. That's what it was, you know. The black child is now in the system, but the white child is fine because the parents paid the $150. I mean, that's an interaction of poverty, you know, unequal recommendations in terms of, you know, punishment. I mean, you know, and so this poor child.